They called him a legend, a soldier's soldier. The kind of man presidents shook hands with and schoolchildren studied in history books. His portrait hung in veterans' halls, medals glinting from a polished uniform, eyes that stared past the frame like they'd seen hell and returned with victory. Newspapers called him the Iron Ghost, a name born from battlefield stories, how he vanished in smoke and reappeared behind enemy lines, how he dragged injured men across minefields with bullets singing past his head. He wasn't just a hero, he was untouchable, a war god in a human shell. But heroes are only human, and sometimes what we worship is what we should fear most. It started long before the war, though no one realized it then. He grew up in a quiet town in the Midwest, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved at every neighbor. His father was a coal worker, his mother a school teacher, and they raised him like any other boy. Polite, quiet, not much of a talker, but always respectful. He got good grades, never got in trouble, and even volunteered at church. But in the woods behind their house, something darker was taking root. Neighborhood pets went missing. A neighbor boy claimed he saw him skinning a rabbit behind the shed. His parents laughed it off. Boys are boys. Imagination runs wild. But the local sheriff remembered that boy. And years later, when the truth came out, he said, "I should have listened then. We all should have." By the time he turned 18, war had broken out. The kind that called every young man to serve, to fight, to bleed for something bigger than himself. He enlisted without hesitation. Basic training turned heads. He wasn't just good, he was surgical, calm under fire, unflinching in the face of chaos. While others shook in their boots, he stood still. When they dropped into enemy territory, he volunteered to lead. He didn't just follow orders, he made them better. They said he could smell danger before it arrived, that he moved through the jungle like a whisper and left enemies dead before they even knew he was near. The first medal came after he carried a wounded officer for miles under fire. The second, when he eliminated an entire machine gun nest with only a pistol and a knife. The third, when he stayed behind to cover his unit's retreat, holding off a wave of attackers with the body of his own fallen comrade. The nation celebrated him. Parades, speeches, newspaper covers with his face. Beneath bold letters, America's unbreakable. The president shook his hand and called him a national treasure. Veterans saluted him. Mothers wept at the sight of him, thanking him for saving their sons. He was the embodiment of courage. But beneath the surface, something colder stirred. His brothers in arms noticed it. The way he smiled after a kill. How he lingered near the bodies. One soldier, who served beside him for 9 months, said he once caught him humming while carving something into a dead man's chest. No one said anything. He was a hero. You don't question legends. You thank them and move on. When the war ended, he returned home to a hero's welcome. Flags waved, bands played, and the whole town turned out to see their boy march down Main Street. But he didn't stay long. Something about civilian life didn't sit right. He tried working in security. Didn't last. Tried teaching at a military academy. Got fired after a student accused him of locking him in a closet for hours. He drank, not like a drunk, but like a man trying to quiet something only he could hear. He took long drives at night. No destination. Just the road, the dark, and the hum of tires on asphalt. The killings began soon after. At first, they were isolated. A drifter found with a broken neck near a rail yard. A hitchhiker missing after being seen getting into a dark sedan. A local girl discovered in a field, hands bound with a military-issued belt. The town grieved. The papers speculated. Police chased shadows, but no one thought to suspect him. Why? Would they? He gave speeches at high schools, donated to veterans' causes, smiled in every photo. He was the one people called when they felt unsafe. The idea that he could be the danger that didn't fit in their minds. But patterns emerged. The victims all vanished near places he had been. The methods were precise, almost clinical. Strangulation, ligature marks, no signs of struggle. Like they never even saw it coming. One detective began to piece it together. A young guy from out of state. He asked questions, pulled records, mapped sightings. He brought it to his captain. The file disappeared. A week later, the detective was reassigned to a burglary unit across the state. Nothing ever came of it. Whispers in the department called it a career killer. Meanwhile, the hero smiled, attended funerals, comforted families. He even carried a casket. Once, weeping beside the mother of a girl he had killed himself, and she thanked him, held his hand, called him her daughter's guardian angel. That night, he buried something behind his house. No one ever dug it up. But decades later, when the ground was finally disturbed, they found buttons, teeth, a child's shoe. There were moments when he seemed almost regretful. Moments when he would sit alone at the bar, staring into nothing. Not drunk, not angry, just vacant. One bartender said he once asked, "Do you think God forgives soldiers?" She smiled and said yes. He shook his head slowly. Even the ones who kept killing when the war ended. Then he finished his drink and left. The bartender told her story years later, when his crimes were finally uncovered. By then, no one was smiling. His killings grew more brazen with time, bolder, like he wanted to be caught. Or maybe he wanted to prove no one ever would. He started leaving things, clues, symbols, a bullet casing near one body, a folded flag near another. He arranged them like art, like little memorials. The press dubbed the killer the Patriot. They had no idea who they were talking about, but he watched the news every night, smiling. Asterisk, the night he killed the soldiers. Widow was when things truly began to unravel. Her name was Evelyn. She had lost her husband in the same battle where he'd earned one of his medals. They'd met at a memorial service. She had thanked him for staying behind, for trying to save her husband, even though he didn't survive. He placed his hand gently on hers and said, "I did what I could." A week later, she was found in her apartment, suffocated with a pillow, her wedding ring missing. Police found no forced entry, no fingerprints. The apartment was spotless. Her neighbor said she had seen Evelyn the night before, walking with a tall man in a military coat. That lead was never followed. After Evelyn, the tempo changed. It was no longer just isolated deaths in remote places. He began killing closer to home. A librarian who once asked him to keep his voice down. A bus driver who clipped his car and didn't apologize. A teen boy who spray painted the war memorial. Their deaths didn't look connected at first, but the rage underneath was unmistakable. Every victim had, in some small way, disrespected him. Or at least, that's how he saw it. They became enemies in his private war. He began keeping a record. A black notebook hidden beneath a false panel in his garage. Inside were pages filled with names, dates, maps, and sketches. Some entries were written like battle reports, others like diary confessions. One page read, "She lied about loving him. That's why he died, and that's why she had to follow." Another showed a diagram of a basement, complete with escape routes and disposal notes. It was methodical, cold, military. No one suspected him. Not truly. The town still loved him. Old women brought him pies. School children saluted him during Veterans Day parades. When a journalist came snooping around, asking uncomfortable questions, he welcomed her into his home, showed her photos, offered her tea, told her stories about war, about sacrifice, about what it means to be forgotten after serving. She left that night shaken, but not because of what he said. It was the way he looked at her, like he was memorizing her. She wrote an article a month later, an op-ed, about the fine line between heroism and violence. No names, just questions. It was buried in the paper's local section and never followed up. Years passed, bodies kept appearing, but they were spaced out, varied in location, type, motive. He was careful. He watched his town like a hunter. He volunteered for veterans events, mentored young ROTC cadets, spoke at city council meetings about public safety. He was the very image of discipline and order, the perfect mask. Behind closed doors, though, the darkness deepened. He created rituals. After each kill, he would polish one of his medals, speak a name, and then place it inside a glass case for an hour, just an hour before, locking it away again. It was as if he was honoring his own depravity, decorating himself for private wars. One of his only friends, an aging Marine who'd served in Korea, began to suspect something. He noticed how often their conversations turned toward death. Not in the usual way veterans swap stories, but in an obsessive, surgical way. He spoke of blood spatter, of breathlessness, of how the light leaves a man's eyes. The Marine once asked, "You ever think maybe we brought something back with us from over there?" He replied, "No, I think we left something behind, like a leash." But the real unraveling began with the girl from the diner. Her name was Lacey, 22. She worked nights and studied during the day. He ate there every Thursday, ordered the same thing, left the same tip. He liked her, not romantically, something else, a fatherly obsession. He watched her, studied her routines. One night, she smiled too long at another man, and something in him snapped. She disappeared 3 days later. Her car was found at a rest stop, keys still inside. Her body was never found. That disappearance triggered a wider investigation. She had told her roommate about a customer who gave her weird vibes. A war vet, quiet, watched her like he was making notes. The roommate gave police a description. It was vague, but it pointed in one direction. An officer followed up, but was discouraged by a superior. "You don't go digging into that man's life," he was told. "He's done more for this country than you ever will." But a private investigator hired by Lacey's family didn't let it go. He started pulling records, timelines, travel logs. What he found was chilling. Wherever this war hero had lived or traveled, bodies followed. Disappearances, unsolved murders, cold cases. The pattern was undeniable, but circumstantial. No hard evidence. The PI presented his findings to law enforcement. They told him to drop it. He didn't. 2 weeks later, his office was burned to the ground. Arson ruled accidental. Behind the scenes, the killer sensed the net tightening. But instead of retreating, he escalated. He killed a homeless man, carving military symbols into his skin. Left him posed at a veteran's memorial with a flag folded neatly in his hands. A statement, a challenge. When the body was discovered, he was standing across the street, saluting with tears in his eyes. It was that moment, captured in a single grainy photograph by a local reporter, that finally started to crack the illusion. A young tech analyst reviewing surveillance footage noticed inconsistencies. His car was parked near 3 different crime scenes. Cell tower pings placed him near 2 disappearances. Still not enough for an arrest, but enough for a warrant. When they entered his home, they expected trophies. They expected a killer's lair. What they found was far worse. Beneath the floorboards, in a climate-controlled room, were dozens of containers, each one labeled with names and dates. Inside were items belonging to the dead lockets, wallets, shoes, belts, strands of hair, even bloodied patches of uniform. His war medals were arranged above them like a shrine. He didn't resist arrest. In fact, he seemed relieved. One officer said he smiled and whispered, "Finally." In the interrogation room, he didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't plead the fifth. He talked, quietly, calmly. "They never knew," he said. "They thought I saved lives, but I only ever knew how to take them." He confessed to 17 murders, but implied there were more. Some were too messy. I don't count those. He described them like missions. Each victim was a target, each kill a procedure. War gave me tools. Home gave me silence. I don't do well in silence. When asked why he did it, He didn't hesitate, because they let me. They trained me to kill. Then they gave me a medal and sent me home like nothing happened. But the killing didn't stop. I just stopped wearing a uniform when I did it. The trial became a national event. For months, the country watched as the face of American valor transformed into something else entirely. News anchors stumbled over their words trying to explain how a man who once dragged bleeding comrades out of firefights had spent decades quietly murdering civilians. Headlines shifted from praise to disbelief, from hero to horror. One paper read, "The medals were real, so were the murders," said another. Commentators debated what it meant for the image of American heroism. Some refused to believe the charges. Others demanded the military explain how this man walked free for so long. Collecting awards while collecting bodies, courtroom spectators lined up before sunrise, hoping for a seat. He sat calmly, dressed in civilian clothes, no longer hiding, but not ashamed either. He answered every question with the discipline of a soldier, clear, measured, cold. When asked about Evelyn, the soldier's widow, he nodded and said, "She reminded me of something I couldn't unsee." When asked about Lacey, he looked up, briefly and said, "She trusted too easily." Each response cut deeper than the last, not because of what he said, but because of how. No remorse, no regret, just acceptance. The prosecution laid out a timeline of horror, photos of victims, maps linking locations, the glass cases from his hidden room, diary entries recovered from his notebook. In one passage he wrote, "I was made efficient, not empathetic." In another, "The world called me a hero, so I gave them a killer." They never saw the difference. The defense had little to work with. Insanity was considered, but psychologists labeled him lucid, aware, and fully in control. One called him a high-functioning sociopath. Another compared him to historical war criminals who operated under the veil of patriotism. Still, his legal team argued that he was a product of war trauma that the government sent him home with, wounds they refused to treat. Veterans groups split down the middle. Some stood behind him, convinced he had been broken by what he saw. Others were outraged, insisting his actions desecrated the honor of service. A few older vets even testified that they had seen signs episodes of violence, threats, nightmares. That never ended, but that no one dared report him. He was one of those guys, one testified, untouchable. You don't question a guy like that unless you want to be labeled ungrateful, or worse. The most haunting testimony came from the one who survived. A woman in her 40s now, who had been just 19 when he attacked her. She told the court how he followed her from a gas station, how he smiled when he asked for directions, how she felt something was off, but didn't want to be rude to a decorated vet. He hit her once, hard enough to knock her out. She woke up bound in the trunk of his car. She escaped only because the trunk latch had been broken, and she clawed her way out when he stopped to smoke. She ran into traffic and flagged down a trucker. Her story had been dismissed at the time. No suspect, no proof. But now, it came back with horrifying clarity. In court, she stood just 10 feet from the man who nearly killed her and said, "You were never a hero. You were just good at hiding." He didn't flinch, just nodded, as if he agreed. The verdict was a formality, guilty on all counts, multiple life sentences, no chance of parole. The judge called it one of the darkest betrayals of public trust in modern history. But even as the sentence was handed down, there was a feeling in the room that the story wasn't over. Something hung in the air, unspoken, something unfinished. In prison, he adapted quickly. No complaints, no demands. He refused interviews but wrote long letters to no one, pages of thoughts, diagrams, reflections. The guards said he was polite, routine, never caused trouble, but he kept to himself. One inmate described him as already dead, just breathing. Others said he sometimes talked to the walls in his sleep, muttering military codes and victim names. Rumors swirled that he was still hiding information, that there were more victims, more buried secrets. Then one night, without warning, he died in his cell. Heart failure, the report said. Quiet, painless, just like he'd killed, but the timing raised questions. A week before his death, a journalist received a package. Inside was a copy of his notebook. Not the one found in his garage, but a second one, hidden somewhere else. This one was filled with new names, unsolved cases from other states, missing people never linked to him. A total of 24 entries. Some just initials, others with full descriptions. Some from decades earlier, some recent. The notebook reignited national interest. If the entries were real, then the full number of his victims could be far higher than anyone imagined. Law enforcement agencies reopened cold cases, piecing together evidence with fresh eyes. The journalist who received the notebook published an expose titled, "The War Didn't End, It Just Changed Uniform." The story went viral. Podcasts, documentaries, theories exploded online. Was he part of something larger? Was he the only one? Even in death, he continued to shape the narrative. His funeral was held in secret. No military honors. No flag on the coffin. Just a pine box lowered into a nameless grave, surrounded by stone and silence. A far cry from the parades and speeches that once followed his every move. His hometown removed his name from plaques. Schools that once held assemblies in his honor distanced themselves. But some still defended him. A quiet minority who believed his crimes were symptoms of a broken system. Not evil, but consequence. Others weren't so forgiving. Families of the victims demanded answers, accountability, closure. But how do you close a wound that was never supposed to exist? How do you explain that the man who once risked his life? 4 strangers also took lives without mercy. The country didn't know what to do with his story. He didn't fit the boxers. He was neither just a hero, nor simply a killer. He was both. And that duality forced a reckoning about what war does to men, about what we celebrate, about who we choose to trust. Some said he became a monster because the military made him one. Others said the uniform merely gave him cover for what he already was. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the dark. Years later, one of his fellow soldiers visited a war memorial where both their names were once engraved. His had since been chiseled off. The soldier placed a hand over the empty space and whispered, "You saved my life once, but I can't forgive what you became." He walked away, leaving behind a medal, the same one the killer had earned so many years ago, placed silently at the base of the stone. Not in honor, not in hate, just acknowledgement. After his death, the public memory of the man split into fragments. For some, he remained the soldier who braved gunfire and saved lives under impossible conditions. For others, he was nothing more than a predator who used the respect society gave him as camouflage. But beyond the polarizing debates, there was something deeper taking shape, a slow, creeping sense of unease about how many others might be out there, decorated, respected, untouchable, and hiding the same sickness behind medals and uniforms. The FBI formed a special task force. Just months after the contents of his second notebook were made public, dozens of cold case files were re-examined. Locations he had traveled to, cities he'd visited for military events, and places where he briefly lived were now seen through a different lens. New leads emerged. A missing teenage girl from Arizona who disappeared the same weekend he spoke at a veterans fundraiser. An unsolved murder of a woman in Ohio just blocks from a military hospital where he'd been treated. The coincidences piled up, some were confirmed, others stayed unresolved. But one thing became increasingly clear. He had moved like a ghost across the country, and he had done so without raising suspicion for decades. The investigative journalists who first broke the story kept digging. They found former commanding officers willing to speak off the record. Several admitted they had been aware of behavioral issues. One said he often returned from missions quiet and cold, sometimes with blood on his uniform that couldn't be explained by battlefield injuries alone. But no one pushed. No one asked questions. You don't accuse a Medal of Honor recipient of anything, one said, especially not when he's still in uniform. The system, it seemed, had built an armor around him that no one dared pierce. His medals, once a source of pride, became a point of controversy. Veterans organizations argued over whether his decorations should be revoked. A congressional hearing was held. Families of his victims testified, demanding justice that extended beyond courtrooms. "You gave him awards for saving lives," one mother said, holding a photo of her daughter. "What about the ones he took?" The debate raged. In the end, the military made a rare decision. While they could not erase history, they issued a formal statement condemning his actions and removed his name from active duty honors rolls. His medals were not physically retrieved, but their presence became hollow, symbolic of a deeper failure. Psychologists were called into the conversation. They examined the intersection between combat trauma and psychopathy. Some argued that war doesn't make killers, it attracts them. Others suggested that prolonged exposure to violence and death can erode the boundaries of morality, especially in soldiers already predisposed to detachment. In interviews, they described a man whose emotional responses had been burned away by years of violence, someone who learned to mimic empathy but never truly felt it. He didn't kill out of rage, he killed out of cold calculation. To him, life was a series of tactical objectives, targets, movements, eliminations. There was a shift in public perception of the military itself. Not a rejection, but it deepened. Scrutiny. Background checks for returning veterans became more rigorous. Mental health programs, long underfunded and understaffed, were suddenly flooded with federal support. PTSD was no longer viewed as just a soldier's problem, it was now seen as a potential societal threat if untreated. Lawmakers referenced his case in speeches. Documentaries used his story as a warning. Schools taught his life as a cautionary tale about unchecked hero worship. But still, questions remained. One of the most haunting discoveries came when a group of amateur sleuths, inspired by the case, began cross-referencing missing persons databases with his known travel records. They found patterns, clusters of disappearances in towns he had passed through on speaking tours, locations where he had temporary residence. Some dates matched entries in his notebook, others were still a mystery. In one chilling find, a campsite deep in Montana's woods was unearthed containing personal effects from multiple victims. Jewelry, clothing, torn IDs. Some of the victims had never been identified before. DNA testing confirmed connections to at least 3 families who had never received closure. The notebook had not exaggerated. If anything, it had held back as more victims were uncovered. A deeper fear spread through the public. How many killers like him were walking free? Men protected by honor, by the illusion of virtue. Men who had learned to wear respectability like a mask. It wasn't just about him anymore. His case had broken something open. The myth of the flawless hero had shattered. The soldier's family, long silent, finally released a statement through an attorney. They expressed horror, grief, and disbelief. They had no idea. His daughter, now in her 20s, gave a single interview. She described him as a man who was never quite present, always disciplined, always in control, but never warm, she said. He rarely hugged her, never told her stories from the battlefield. He kept his war locked in a box. And now she knew why. He compartmentalized everything, she said. Even his love. I don't think he knew how to feel without orders. In that same interview, she revealed something else. A third notebook. One that she found in a storage unit registered under a fake name. It was hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. This one was different, less detailed, more cryptic. Drawings, military coordinates, codes, phrases repeated over and over like mantras. One page just read, "Kill, clean, kill, quiet. Never kill without purpose." Another said, "They trained me to end lives. I just kept doing what I was told." The notebook reignited the question of intent. Was he acting on his own twisted desires, or was he executing some kind of private mission? Some speculated he had become convinced he was continuing the war on American soil. Others believed he saw himself as a purifier, eliminating those he saw as weak or unworthy. A few fringe theorists even suggested he had been part of a covert program, trained beyond standard means, used for operations the public was never meant to know about and then discarded when he became inconvenient. There was no proof, just fear, the kind that grows in the gaps left by too many unanswered questions. Over time, the country's obsession with the case evolved into something else, a kind of cultural scar. It became a symbol of how blind faith in institutions can leave us vulnerable, of how stories of heroism can be weaponized, and of how even the most celebrated figures can be hiding darkness that no one wants to see. Memorial Day. Ceremonies were quieter that year. A few featured moments of silence for the victims, not the ones from foreign wars, but the ones who died here, at home, forgotten until it was too late. One small town in Virginia held a vigil, candles lit for each confirmed victim, 20 flames flickering in the night, each representing a life that had trusted the wrong man. A former military chaplain stood at the podium. He had known the man years ago, performed blessings before missions. He spoke softly, voice cracked with age and shame. "We gave him our prayers, we gave him our faith, but we never gave him our questions, and in our silence, he found cover." The audience stood in silence, no applause, no tears, just stillness, the kind that only follows a truth too heavy to carry, yet too dangerous to ignore. Asterisk. In the aftermath of the revelations, America entered a period of introspection. Media outlets that had once celebrated the war hero now turned their attention to the people and systems that allowed his darkness to flourish unchecked. They examined the very institutions that had upheld him as a national icon. Journalists revisited old interviews where he had spoken in carefully measured words, never emotional, always composed. Some began to rewatch the grainy footage of his medal ceremony, searching his face for signs of duplicity, for any flicker of something sinister behind the mask of honor, but they found nothing. That was what terrified them the most, how perfectly he had blended in. The Department of Defense commissioned an internal review. Dozens of high-ranking officials were interviewed. The report, though heavily redacted, confirmed what many feared. Background checks had missed early warnings. Psych evaluations had been outdated or manipulated. And most disturbingly, some signs of his violent tendencies had been quietly covered up to protect the reputation of the military. An altercation during a deployment in which a civilian woman was found dead under suspicious circumstances had been ruled an accident and never reported to civilian law enforcement. Another report detailed how a fellow soldier raised concerns about his disturbing comments during a mission only to be transferred weeks later. The review concluded with a chilling admission: the system had failed. At the same time, true crime communities began dissecting the killer's behavior. His methods were analyzed in podcasts and documentaries. Some called him calculated, a planner who left as little trace as possible. Others saw the military structure reflected in his crimes, each one clean, efficient, devoid of chaos. One profiler remarked that his actions were not crimes of passion, but missions of control. He didn't kill for thrill or revenge. He killed to restore order, at least in his own twisted worldview. A particularly unsettling pattern emerged. Many of his victims were marginalized sex workers, addicts, undocumented individuals, people often ignored by society, people whose disappearances didn't trigger nationwide searches or media attention. He had chosen victims that no one would go looking for. In doing so, He had exploited the same societal indifference that had protected him in the military. He didn't just hide behind his medals. He also hid behind the invisibility of his victims. That revelation sparked a national conversation about whose lives are deemed worthy of justice and whose are forgotten the moment they vanish. One journalist tracked down a surviving victim. She had been attacked but managed to escape in 2007. At the time, she had been in and out of shelters, addicted to heroin, and her report to police had been dismissed as incoherent rambling. But she remembered everything. His eyes, his voice, the way he wrapped the cord around her neck with clinical precision. She passed out, woke up in a ditch, and assumed she had dreamed it. When his face appeared on the news, years later, her memories came flooding back. She had survived a ghost, a man no one believed could do harm. Her interview aired nationally and brought tears to the eyes of people who had once idolized him. For the first time, the survivors had a face, not just the face of evil, but a face of those who lived through it and were never believed. Public backlash intensified. Statues bearing his likeness were defaced. His hometown, once proud of their native son, renamed streets and parks that had honored him. A mural painted in his image was replaced with a memorial to his known victims. But while the physical symbols were removed, the deeper question remained. How did no one see it? Former soldiers who had served with him struggled with guilt. Some went on record saying he had saved their lives in combat, that he had pulled them from burning vehicles, carried them across enemy lines, risked his own safety without hesitation. They couldn't reconcile the man who had shown such courage with the man who had left bodies across the country. He was a hero, one said, tears in his voice, and a monster, both. I don't know how that's possible. Forensic psychologists tried to explain it. They pointed to cases where extreme trauma reshapes a person's identity, where battlefield conditions strip away emotional response until all that remains is action and instinct. But in his case, they found traits that predated his military service. School records showed he had been violent with animals as a child. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. A cousin recalled a strange incident when they were 12. He had taken apart a bird with his hands, calmly, almost curiously. The signs were there, but no one connected them, or worse, no one wanted to. Another disturbing angle emerged from his early military training. One instructor described him as too eager, not for duty, but for violence. He excelled in close quarters, combat. He never flinched in simulations. He once joked that killing was just like clearing code from a dirty hard drive. Cold, clinical. The instructor reported the comment, but it was brushed off as dark humor common among soldiers. Now, it looked more like a glimpse behind the mask. The national psyche was rattled. Parents became more cautious of praising blind obedience. Teachers were trained to spot early signs of sociopathy. Veterans returning from deployment were offered expanded mental health evaluations and reintegration programs. One senator proposed a bill requiring all decorated soldiers to undergo annual psychological assessments. It passed with bipartisan support. The war hero's legacy, once a symbol of pride, had become a reason to reform. But the damage was already done. Families would never see their loved ones again. Survivors carried scars no ceremony could heal. And the nation, now more cynical, understood that evil can wear any uniform, even one stitched with valor. In one final twist, a posthumous letter surfaced, sent anonymously to a news outlet. It bore handwriting matching his journals. It was addressed to the people I fooled. The letter was brief, chilling. It read, "You gave me your applause, your flag, your trust. I wore them all like armor. You asked for a hero. I became your ghost. And while you slept, I did what I was trained to do without borders, without hesitation, without guilt. You built me, and you never asked what I did when no one was watching." The letter ended with a signature his last name followed by a number, 39. Investigators believed this number could be the final count of his victims. If true, it meant several had yet to be found. The revelation reignited the search. Independent investigators, armed with maps, journals, and AI tools, began working to uncover the full extent of his crimes. Each discovery, each shallow grave or abandoned cabin, was met with both relief and horror. Relief that the truth was finally surfacing. Horror at how deep the darkness ran. By the time the dust settled, he had become more than just a man. He was a symbol, a cautionary tale, a mirror reflecting a truth. No one wanted to face that heroism and monstrosity can live in the same soul. And sometimes, the world is too eager to see only one side. Years passed, but the name of the most decorated war hero turned serial killer remained a wound that never fully healed. For some, time softened the shock, letting history blur the sharp edges of the horror. But for the families of the victims, there was no such comfort. Their grief didn't follow the same timeline. Their healing had to begin from a place of betrayal, from knowing the man who took everything from them had been honored, protected, and paraded through streets like a savior, while their loved ones were buried quietly, forgotten until truth clawed its way out. In small towns across America, memorials were updated, not with his name, but with those of the victims whose lives he had stolen. Communities once proud to display his portrait now lit candles for the ones he silenced. The traveling exhibit moved from city to city, not to recount his military achievements, but to educate people about the signs that were missed, the patterns ignored, the red flags dismissed, the cost of blind reverence. Parents brought their children to learn. Schools added it to their curriculum in courses on ethics, media literacy, and the psychological consequences of unchecked power. But even as the world vowed to remember the victims, there were those who couldn't let go of the man they once idolized. Some veterans, particularly those who had served under him, found themselves emotionally torn. One former sergeant confessed in an interview that he owed his life to him. During a mission in a desert province, he had taken a bullet meant for the entire squad. He didn't hesitate. The man said, "That wasn't fake. That was real. He saved us. I don't know how to hate him." This confusion rippled through society. It sparked deep debates on morality. Can a hero also be a killer? Do good deeds erase evil? Or are they simply a mask for something darker? Can war twist a man? Or does it merely reveal what's always been hidden beneath the surface? Clergy, scholars, psychologists all took turns dissecting the question, but the answers were never simple. Because this story wasn't simple. It didn't follow a neat arc. It didn't give anyone the satisfaction of closure. In secret forums and encrypted chat groups, darker conversations took place. Some fringe groups began idolizing him, not as a war hero, but as a symbol of ultimate control. They printed his image on t-shirts, wrote manifestos inspired by his journals, and called him a patriot who saw through the illusion of peace. These groups were quickly flagged by authorities and classified as dangerous, but their existence proved something chilling, even in exposure. Evil can find new followers. Law enforcement used what they learned from his case to update behavioral profiles and training procedures. The FBI created a task force dedicated to tracking high-functioning serial predators capable of living double lives, blending perfectly into society, committing horrific acts while maintaining public trust. His case became the cornerstone of that training. New recruits were taught to look for patterns, not reputations. They were reminded that titles and medals don't grant immunity from scrutiny. Meanwhile, his family remained in hiding. His wife, whose testimony had first raised public suspicion, never returned to public life. She moved across the country with a new identity. In one rare recorded statement, she said, "I loved him. I didn't know what he was, but I slept next to a monster for years, and that haunts me more than anything." Their children were given new names, new schools, and a lifetime of counseling. They were taught that their father's legacy was not their burden to carry. A best-selling book emerged from the ashes of the story. Written by a journalist who had spent 3 years investigating the case, it detailed every known victim, every confirmed kill, every hidden journal page recovered from his cabin. The book was less about the man himself and more about the culture that birthed him. It challenged readers to think differently about how society defines heroism. It suggested that maybe we celebrate symbols too quickly, without asking what lies beneath the surface. The book won awards, but more importantly, it sparked conversation. And those conversations, uncomfortable as they were, began reshaping how America saw itself. Universities launched research programs on dual identity criminals. Psychologists studied the intersections of trauma, military training, and latent psychopathy. Law schools examined the legal gaps that allowed him to evade detection for so long. Slowly, system by system, change began to root itself in the cracks he left behind. His destruction had forced a new kind of vigilance, one not built on suspicion, but on humility. A realization that even the brightest metals can cast the darkest shadows. And then, one final development emerged that stunned the nation again. A forensic team, working through a long-abandoned mine in New Mexico, uncovered a hidden chamber sealed with military-grade locks. Inside were remnants of uniforms, military gear, and a journal never recovered before. In it, he described in chilling clarity a philosophy he had never revealed publicly. He believed he was cleansing the world of what he called unworthy life, not out of hatred, but out of order. He saw himself as a judge, not for vengeance, not for glory, but for balance. His final entry read, "I was the weapon. You gave me the mission. And when peace became chaos, I simply stayed on assignment." The entry confirmed what many feared. He never felt guilt. He never questioned himself. To him, the murders weren't crimes. They were continuations of his duty, carried out in silence while the world clapped. That journal now sits behind bulletproof glass in a museum dedicated to criminal psychology. It's not there to honor him but to warn, to remind people that the most terrifying villains are not the ones who shout, but the ones who smile, the ones we trust, the ones we elevate without question. In the end, he didn't just kill people, he broke something deep inside the nation's conscience. And while the medals were stripped and the records amended, the impact of his deception will live on far longer than his war stories, because evil, when dressed in honor, becomes nearly invisible. And when a society applauds too loudly without asking why, they may just find themselves building pedestals for monsters. So if there's one thing this story demands of you, it's this: ask questions, even of your heroes, especially of your heroes. Trust must be earned, not awarded. Respect must be matched with responsibility. And the next time the crowd gathers to cheer, take a moment, look deeper. The truth isn't always in the medals, it's in the silence between the applause. If this story shook you, made you think differently, or opened your eyes to the complexity of good and evil, share it. Let others hear what the headlines missed. Subscribe for more stories that peel back the layers of history and human nature. And remember, true justice begins with awareness.